Given the amount of work that we have this week, we're going to be tackling these vidcasts in 3 parts. One for Flew, one for Hare, and one for Mitchell. Make sure that you finish your Ralph Hutt reading first, so you can properly understand what the problem of evil is and what theodicy is before approaching Theology and Falsification. Theology and Falsification is a work by 3 authors. One starts off by writing an article, and then that article was distributed, and others have responded to that article. And so what we have is a collection of those discussions. Now this begins with Flew's article about theology and what it really means. And he says that really many times theology winds up being meaningless. The reason why he says that stems from his philosophical background. Flew is what we call a logical positivist. What logical positivism is a branch of philosophy that understands what can be said, what has meaning, and separates ideas of what has meaning from what does not. And they say that in order to have meaning, an assertion must be falsifiable. Now, this goes all the way back to Epistemology Part 3, where we discussed falsifiability and unfalsifiability. He says that anything that has meaning must be falsifiable. And he says that theology starts off as something that seems like it might be filled with assertions, and it might have meaning, but in fact it doesn't. He illustrates this by saying, if we take, for example, a 5-year-old who is dying of horrible, inoperable throat cancer, there is the theological proposition that God loves us as a father loves his children. Well, if there's this child with a throat cancer, most earthly fathers will do everything in their power to try to alleviate the pain and suffering and heal their 5-year-old child. Whereas we can see from the fact that we do have horrible tragedies like throat cancer and horrible, painful deaths of young children, that God does not seem to stop this with the same vigor and vim as would an earthly father. So given this, it starts off as something that would be falsifiable. Flew says that if we left it at that and said, okay, obviously God does not love as a father loves his child, then it's a falsifiable statement and therefore has meaning. Unfortunately, it would be falsified in that, if that case happens to be. So that leaves the theologian nowhere. And so Flew observes that what happens is the person of faith or the theologian will go back and revise this idea of God loves us as a father loves his children, and will amend it and change it into something that is unfalsifiable. First, it might be something like, well, God has a greater plan. Or perhaps, God's love is an inscrutable love. And as soon as we start changing the idea of love, and so it fits into a bigger plan, or even changing the meaning of the word love, or any number of these theodicies that don't hold water, and Flew might argue any theodicy at all, then we start changing this falsifiable statement into something that is unfalsifiable, something that has meaning into something that has no meaning. And the way this happens is slowly at first. It seems as though these things might be assertions and then are slowly whittled away. They're nickeled and dimed to death, really, much as in the parable of the gardener. As you remember from your reading, 2 explorers find a beautiful garden, and one says it is tended by a gardener, and the other says it is not. They wait and see, they see no gardener. The other one says it's an invisible gardener, and so they set up all these silly tests to see whether or not there was a gardener. And in the end, the original one who said there was a gardener still remains unconvinced, even after putting up electric fences, bloodhounds, all sorts of things that might yield whether or not there's a gardener. He still says it is an invisible gardener that has no scent, that is impervious to electric shocks, yet there is still a gardener. this has obviously whittled something that was a falsifiable statement into something that is meaningless. And Flew says that the theologian, or the person of faith, takes statements such as God loves us, his Father loves his children, or God created the world, and winds up having their propositions nickeled and dimed to death. And that really his whole point of his article is to say that theologians really should understand that their work is meaningless. After he distributes this, both Hare and Mitchell take up the side of the theologian and respond. And you'll have to check the next vidcast to see how that turns out.